from a sold-out, jacked-up Sam Boyd Stadium in Las Vegas. Week 1 of the XFL, the New York, New Jersey Hitmen and the Las Vegas Outlaws. It is perhaps the most eagerly anticipated inauguration that the sports world has seen in quite a while. The creation of a brand new style football league, the XFL. Matt Vasgersian, Jesse Ventura, and Jesse, as excited as fans have been for this day to come, the guys really excited for this are those guys out on the field.
Absolutely, Matt. It's the players, and let me talk about the players for a moment and the sacrifices they have had to make to play the game that they love. Many of them left jobs, they left loved ones, and they put it all on the line because practice started in November. They got paid not one nickel to go through these practices to arrive here tonight. They put it all on the line. Now, tonight they will get paid. But the thing I love about the XFL is the heart and soul that these players show for the love of the game, of playing football, and the opportunity of continuing to play the game they love here in the XFL.
It's a night of firsts in Las Vegas, and to help us kick off this historic night, let's go down to the field with Mike Adamle.
Ladies and gentlemen, he is the personification of the XFL. He is the league's director of competition. He is Hall of Famer Dick Butkus.
You know, in the past, all football games get started with a coin toss. No way, Jose. Here we are in the XFL. We're going to compete for the right to choose who possesses the ball at the start of the game. 2 players, 1 ball. Whoever possesses the ball gets his choice, not only for the start of the game, but also for overtime, should that be necessary. Good luck, guys.
And once again, to win the scramble, you must have full possession. Representing the New York, New Jersey Hitmen, number 21, safety, Donnie Caldwell. For the Las Vegas Outlaws, number 28, safety, Jamel Williams. Let's go to head referee, Randy Crystal.
Okay, once again, guys, it's going to be ready, set, and a whistle. Don't jump and go for the ball, not each other. Ready, set.
Couple of safeties going to scramble for the right to possession. The hometown hero is on it, but the ball's still alive. Jamel Williams jumps on it. Yes. And the hometown guys have right to kick or receive. We haven't even started yet, Buddy, and the place is already going nuts.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Oh my God, let's get this show on the road, shall we? How are you, everybody? My name is Tim Hanlon, indeed, and it is Good Seats Still Available. That curious little podcast, not so little anymore, actually, devoted to what used to be in professional sports. We are finally delving into our initial conversations around the XFL and some synergies here, some balance, some closing of circles, shall we say, because we're dropping this episode early in the wee hours of February 3rd, 2019, which just so happens to be 18 years to the date of when you heard that clip of the inaugural XFL game between the New York, New Jersey Hitmen and the Las Vegas Outlaws on NBC television. Yes, that's what you heard way back when, 18 years ago today. And it's also 19 years to the date when the league, the XFL, Vince McMahon, announced that the league was going to be forming and under wraps to be launched a year afterwards. And it would not surprise me, frankly, that in 2020, just literally 1 year away from today, that on February 3rd, 2020, would be the potential relaunch date of the previously announced XFL yes, it's coming back, as you probably well know. We'll see in what form. And as we get through our conversation with today's special guest, Brett Forrest, we'll sort of get some sense of what that first original league was, that joint venture between the WWF, at the time now the WWE, Vince McMahon, and NBC Sports, then helmed by one Dick Ebersol. And some very interesting stories from Brett, who wrote the book, literally and figuratively, on the XFL. It is a book that is out of print. It's called Long Bomb, How the XFL Became TV's Biggest Fiasco. It was published in 2002 by Crown. It is out of print, and it is a hot commodity on all the online book sources, Amazon and others. Used copies are going for $100, $200 a piece, and brand new copies for those that exist. And you hear that Brett's got a couple of those copies in his office somewhere, are going for $400 or $500 a piece. I'm not going to tip off the rest of the conversation, but you'd think from a marketing perspective that the opportunity to reissue that book and maybe reframe it with some updating and maybe as a scene setter for what the next version, XFL 2.0, if you will, starting next year might look like, the opportunity would be. But if you have a copy of that book, it is quite valuable. If you want a copy of the book, you can, of course, go to goodseatsstillavailable.com, our little website here, search up episode number 98. And you'll find a link probably to the least expensive versions of that via Amazon and mostly from the reselling community. But it is well worth finding. It's a very fun trapezing through the one and only year of the XFL. Some great stories in there. In particular, as you'll hear in our conversation with Brett coming up, walking through some of the day-to-day with one of those franchises. So there's a microcosm of that league, the Las Vegas Outlaws. And obviously a very colorful team. Didn't make the playoffs, but certainly had some of the more interesting stories of the XFL in Las Vegas. Rod Smart being one of them. He hate me. The moniker that Mr. Smart put on the back of his jersey and became almost an instant phenomenon with sports fans everywhere, and went on to a Super Bowl and some other great NFL exploits, as did, by the way, a lot of his teammates wound up going on to other exploits in professional football, some in the Arena League, certainly some in the NFL, the CFL, etc., as did a whole bunch of those players in the XFL, and you'll hear from Brett in our conversation. A lot of these guys were simply just looking for another shot, but amidst what, of course, became quite the circus on television, in the stadiums, and just overall. And we all sort of know what sort of happened during the course of that league. But if you weren't around for it or you vaguely remember it, allow us to have this conversation with Brett, with you, to kind of sort of scene set the craziness that transpired with the XFL, and clearly there will be other stories to come in our journeys together. But we wanted to sort of finally kick off our conversation around this league, the intrigue around it, and I suspect there'll be more intrigue around its past and maybe we think present and hopefully future next year as it launches anew in 2020. And that is the conversation this week. And we welcome you to it. And let us get a little promotional thing out of the way first, and we'll get right into it, shall we? Okay. We want to highlight this week's sponsor, 503 Sports, 503-sports.com, the king of throwbacks, and a particularly excellent sponsor for this week's episode, because at 503 Sports, that's 503-sports.com, you will find, and I think perhaps the only place really online you're going to find this stuff, is original and high quality XFL shirts and caps, and even some jerseys in there from 503 Sports. Again, that's 503-sports.com. And you go to the website. I'm just kind of scrolling at it now. I mean, there's obviously T-shirts, from all the teams, and we're talking all the 8 teams of the XFL. and you'll find T-shirts with the great logos and stuff. You'll find caps with the logos on it. And yes, your Orlando Rage fans, you San Francisco Demons fans, they're all there for you. Chicago Enforcers proudly represented. Of course, the Outlaws. Of course, the LA Extreme, the ultimate champion of the league, etc. All the others are there. But in addition to the T-shirts and the caps, you're also going to find, and this is something that 503 Sports does extremely well and uniquely, are originally created and lovingly so jerseys that are recreated in small batches. There's only a handful of them made, but they are customizable for a few of those teams. The San Francisco Demons jersey is there for you to purchase. A Las Vegas Outlaws jersey is on the docket. You'll find a jersey for the New Jersey Hitmen, as well as for the Chicago Enforcers. There's a Memphis Maniacs, yes, with an X jersey there as well. And I don't think there are other jerseys for the other remaining teams, but there are certainly, like I said, shirts, some sweatshirts in there, some caps, and I suspect that our friends at 503 Sports will indeed be on the march towards recreating jerseys for those other teams, as well as some other things for you to wear from the old and original version of the XFL. So I think it's the only place online you're going to find these. And again, that's 503 Sports. That's 503-sports.com. And make sure, of course, when you're there and you find one of those things that you want to remember the XFL, make sure you use that promo code SEATS for 10% off all of your purchases when you go to 503 Sports. Again, 503-sports.com. The promo code you want to use is SEATS. You want to get 10% off all of your XFL garb and wear. And by the way, they have other tons of other things there at 503 Sports. But if you're interested in this week's episode and all the teams and the memories, this is the place to go for all of your XFL needs. Again, 503 Sports. That's 503-sports.com. And make sure you use the promo code SEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. Thank you, 503 Sports, and thank you for sticking around for our very fun and interesting conversation with Brett Forrest. He, the author of Long Bomb, and we're going to get into XFL. Here it is, our conversation just last week. First of all, I think your book about the original XFL, right, is the seminal work. There hasn't been a whole lot written about it, and frankly, it was probably the best narrative that I have seen to date, perhaps aside from the 30 for 30 documentary that Charlie Ebersol and friends did a few years back, right? But that's, in a video form. Maybe you can give our audience a bit of background as to your professional career, and then maybe sort of what seems like, and I think we'll get to it in a few minutes, maybe a little bit of a long and winding road to this story.
Yeah, sure. Geez. This is going back a few years. This is like 18 years now. It's hard to believe that that's how long ago this thing was, the XFL, that is. Boy, my interest in it really, let me think. So at that time, I was a freelance magazine writer living in New York, and just doing whatever I could to scrape together a few pennies here and there, whoever was hiring. Whatever they wanted me to write about, I was doing. I was a younger guy just trying to establish myself in that world. And there was this magazine that had just recently been established by this guy, Bob Guccione Jr., the famous name, of course. We know his dad was the founder of Penthouse, but he himself, the son, was also in the magazine business. He had started Spin Magazine, and anyhow, he had recently launched Gear Magazine, which was sort of a men's magazine, like a lad magazine, if you will. And so I'd linked up with them and had done a couple of things, and they said, we talked about this idea for a story on the XFL, which, boy, I mean, we go back to those years, the WWF, I think it was called at the time, was at its absolute peak. It had made Vince McMahon a billionaire. He couldn't be more confident about his business acumen and his vision, and he was just this incredible marketer and publicity hound, and people just were listening to everything he had to say. And so he was publicizing this new league, the XFL, along with NBC, which was a 50% partner. And so it came to my notice as it did to everyone else's, and so I was talking about this with my editors of the magazine. And they said, well, why don't you go out and see what you could figure out. So this was before the league began, and they were already in training camp with the players. And I said, you know what? There's a team in Vegas. I want to go check out that team because this sounds like the perfect place for this crazy idea. And so I flew out there, and one of the first people I met was Dick Ebersol, the face of pro football, if you will.
Yeah, not a bad place to start, right?
Yeah. So Butkus had kind of like linked up with these guys, some like semi-formal, informal sort of advisory role to the league. Okay, and I thought, well, heck, if Butkus is signing up to this thing, then I mean it must have something to it, right? So I met him there at a practice for the Vegas team, the Las Vegas Outlaws. And he was there with his son, Matt, who had played at USC and was a big offensive lineman type guy. And Matt and I were about the same age, and we kind of hit it off and became friends. And, I was talking to Dick Butkus about this whole thing. And anyway, the experience there was eye-opening. And on the way on the plane back to New York, I thought, this thing it could make for an interesting book, because I hadn't written a book yet, and I was eager to try. And I just, I filed the magazine article. That all went okay. And then just as the league was beginning, that's when I started thinking seriously about, okay, could this thing support the telling, like a narrative like a longer narrative? And anyway, so that's sort of the germ of the idea.
All right. So before we get into the end of that beginning part of the story, which we'll talk about in a second, and I think you know where I'm going to go with that. What was your conclusion or your observation of this? I'm guessing this was around the year 2000, right? Which is the year before the league started in 2001. What was the thesis and or the vibe that you got and the sense that you were getting about this league as it was still, I guess, in its formative pre-launch months?
Yeah, well, it really a mixed bag, so many different. The league made you think so many different things before it started. That is, and I'll just throw a bunch of them out there. It made me think, Vince McMahon. Like, I'm not a huge pro wrestling guy. I'm not against it. Of course, like growing up, I was exposed to it and knew all the characters and I thought it was kind of funny, but I wasn't like a big fanatic of it. So I wasn't a big Vince McMahon fan. I wasn't against him. I was open. My mind was open. But here's this guy who is known for staging like a sporting event, right? Pro wrestling, where the outcome is known beforehand. And now he's going to do something that's a real bona fide competition. Well, that's a big question mark. How's that going to come out? How's that going to come across? So that was one of the main questions that I had, and I think most people had. How's Vince McMahon going to run a real sports league? And from the NBC side, though, it really, the idea made a lot of sense to me. And I'll tell you why. Because ever since ABC created Monday Night Football for the NFL, remember, this is not an NFL creation, it's a TV creation, Monday Night Football. The value of the contract to broadcast the rights for the NFL skyrocketed. And it got to the point by the time the XFL rolled around that it was a guaranteed losing proposition for all the networks, meaning they knew going into negotiations or bidding for NFL rights that if they won the rights, that over the course of the contract they were gonna just take a bath. They were gonna lose tons and tons of money on it. And but all these networks and network executives decided that this was just something that they had to do because the NFL gave them an incredible billboard for all their other programming. And that's why, you watch these NFL games and it's just you're constantly bombarded with, oh, next Tuesday, and you get the sitcom that's coming up on the network next Tuesday. So networks felt like we got to pay this price in order to stay in the game for the attention of the viewer. But Dick Ebersol, who was the head of NBC Sports at the time, he got fed up with that arrangement. And he said, you know what? NBC is not going to even put our hat in the ring for the next opportunity to bid for these rights. And instead, we're going to have our own league. And he and Vince had gone back many years. When Dick was with NBC earlier in his career, he put pro wrestling on NBC, which was a big milestone for pro wrestling. So for NBC, like, to my mind, it was an interesting gamble for them to take, and it made some fiscal sense. So that's like from the business point of view. So, the XFL was an interesting theoretical idea, and I felt like it was worth paying attention to it.
Yeah, that's interesting. So a lot of my professional career has been in the advertising and media buying space, various ad agencies and holding companies and the like. In the early part of the 2000s, I vividly remember a number of TV ad sales folks from the XFL and the NBC. And it's also important to remember, sort of, I don't know if it's an asterisk, right? But TNN, the Nashville Network, as it was called back then, as well as UPN, which are the two new startup TV networks, along with the WB, which then became the CW down the road. These were all networks that were part of the mixture that was going to be sort of in this promotional vein of this 8-team league. And I think in the hallways of the ad agency and the media buying shop that I was at, it was kind of it certainly garnered attention, right? You could not ignore, despite your feelings about professional wrestling, the audacity and the just high visibility of what this thing was going to be. But and maybe tell me if you agree, I think the question was, okay, you got our attention. What is this going to be?
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. Yeah, I mean, it was just Vince McMahon's incredible ability to attract attention, especially back then. This was, if you remember, it was also a heady time on the stock market. As I mentioned earlier, his success with pro wrestling had made him a billionaire. That was sort of a tech bubble at the time, if I'm remembering correctly, because it was a few years ago now. The XFL in some ways, and I don't want to overplay this, but in some ways is emblematic of that period. And then when the XFL ultimately failed, not to spoil this for anybody, but the economy also in a similar time frame sort of it took a bit of a dip. So, but yes, you're right that people were drawn to it as a curiosity, and they also felt like, look, if these two parties, which are you have one party which has always been sort of on the outside of respectability, if you will, the pro wrestling, but is now this incredibly powerful economic juggernaut. And then you have this sort of respected legacy media company, and these two parties are partnering up, and they both think this is a good idea. Well, yeah, boy, what is this thing?
Yeah, and you talk about economics a second, and I'm going to get back to sort of the journey on the book. Yeah, I mean, I think NBC at the time also was, because of the loss of all those NFL rights, and certainly something that we see even today, right, how powerful the NFL is to the success of broadcast television, arguably even propping it up amongst media aficionados and practitioners such as myself. But the idea NBC seemed to be exploring quite a bit around was sort of these, I guess, different approaches to economics, right? Sort of some ancillary or alternative, I guess, approaches to, I guess, the deficit spending proposition of buying rights not unlike, say, the Olympics, which they've already had locked up. But, a fool's errand if they're going to keep paying more and more and more and hoping that they're going to recoup and then some on these kind of marquee properties. So you have to give them, Ebersol and friends, some points here on the board for, at least trying to experiment with some different models, some ownership, originating the content, if you will, and frankly, de-risking, I guess, what looked to be at the time, and certainly proven out, a crazily expensive sports rights landscape.
Yeah. I mean, look, it makes sense for a broadcaster to balk at continuing to pay these rising prices. But the problem with the XFL, and of course we can get this later, is that that shouldn't lead you into making a rash decision. So I think that while the NBC's motivation, its base motivation, was a positive one, a worthy one, I'm not sure that the execution of the ultimate idea, and the idea being to get out of this crazy relationship with the NFL and into something that makes more financial sense. I don't think that execution was up to.
Yeah, let me close the loop on this prelude because there's so many other nooks and crannies here that I want to get to. So, two areas that we've kind of explored in our silly little show over the last year and a half or so is one is that football, right, uniquely and perhaps most prominently versus most of the all the other sort of professional sports in the United States, North America, has seemingly led the pack in terms of attracting challengers to the NFL and its supremacy of that professional football game, borne out by another league that's going to start in a couple of weeks from when we record this show, the Alliance of American Football, and, of course, we'll talk about this probably near the end, a reboot, hopefully probably not the same sort of environment, of the XFL itself. So what is it, do you think, of football that sort of attracts this? And then the other sort of question, I guess, as part of a prelude to finish this little theme out, is also another area we explore, which is sort of the single entity concept, right? Instead of sort of selling franchises and all that, kind of controlling the dynamics from the outset, managing expenses and that kind of stuff, and hopefully keeping ownership in line. Of course, not much ownership to keep in line. You got two major partners here in this one.
Yeah. Well, why football? Well, a couple reasons. One is just it's a financial thing. Football, pro football, the NFL is just so darn successful, and it's so popular. And hey, this is the United States of America, and it's a free market. So I applaud anybody who says, I'm going to put my money where my mouth is. I'm going to work hard at this thing. I'm going to try and create my own entrepreneurial opportunity for myself. Go do it. I mean, that's what our system is about. So the other reason, though, well, in addition, let's say, is the fact that challengers to the NFL in the past have been very successful. I mean, the AFL. This was so successful that it just became part of the NFL. The USFL. This went on for several seasons, was very successful in several markets. I remember going to games as a kid myself in Philly, where the vet was sold out for the Philadelphia Stars. And if it wasn't for, let's say, I'd say most people would say that if it wasn't for our current president, that the USFL would have continued for a number of seasons more. As you remember, he was an owner of one of the teams in that league at the time. Anyway, so the point is that people have been successful in challenging the NFL in the past, or challenging may be a strong word. They've been successful in creating viable businesses for themselves. So why not try again?
Yeah, growing the pie, right? And and I also think the single entity approach is also and has been proven to be sort of a much more prudent way for something fledgling versus sort of assuming, say, in the WFLs, to go to the opposite extreme, in the mid 70s, right, which was sort of this, I don't want to call it house of cards, but alongside the ABA and World Team Tennis and the World Hockey Association, right, that was all sort of franchise driven. and it was almost like the last owner in, sort of like dealt with the Ponzi effects at the end. But again, this case here, we've got two major entities. To your point, you'd think that they knew something, or they had at least some sound economics to this. All right, so on economics, let's before we get into the tale of the league itself, let's talk about your economics, because walk us through sort of, you've done this story, it's in gear, you know they're onto something. Walk us through sort of, shall we say, the compensation arrangement for that little assignment, and also how you were able to cajole an author or a book publisher, to allow you to kind of take the long view and start the research and the investigation for a book that ultimately would become the league's epitaph, but at least was going to be a long assignment to document sort of what's going on in the first year of this league.
Right. Are you talking about the magazine article and the payment for that article?
Oh yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, there was this magazine called Gear, run by Bob Guccione Jr. And Bob Guccione Jr. was known. His reputation was sort of. He was like, how do you put it? He was he enjoyed a drink, and he enjoyed hanging out, and he had led a bit of a jet set lifestyle. And I mean, his father was the publisher and founder of Penthouse, so this was a guy who knew how to have fun, let's say. And he was less good at running a business. And the thing is that I wasn't getting paid, and it wasn't just me. I had done a few articles for them, and they owed me, a handful of $1,000, which is not much, maybe, but for me at the time, it was, I was trying to like make my rent every month, which was a challenge as a freelance writer. So I talked to a lot of other writers and photographers who were contributing to that magazine, and I heard that it was basically, this is the common tale, that he wasn't. Look, he was starting a new business, and it was a new magazine and all that. So, that's obviously a big challenge. But he wasn't.
He also started Spin.
Really,
didn't he also start Spin as well?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
He started Spin, and he had actually been sort of forced to sell it. There were some allegations that he had sort of. I don't want to get too far into it. I'm no expert in it. It's a legal issue, but apparently there were some harassment issues, and he went from unloading Spin to starting Gear. And now he wasn't paying anybody. And I just said, I don't feel like working for someone like this. Why would I continue to put my time and effort into something without getting paid? I mean, hey, it's a reasonable conclusion, right? So I just said, I basically wrote off the relationship, and I said, well, at least let's have fun with this on the way out the door. So I called up a guy that I'd met at the New York Observer newspaper, and I mentioned this to him, and I said, I'm going to run a little operation here, and are you interested in, if it goes well, in writing about it? He said, oh, yeah, that sounds great. So I went to the Gear offices in New York, in Manhattan, and one morning, and I asked the receptionist if I could speak to the finance manager, and then identified myself. You have a debt with me, and of course they said the same thing they'd said to me for the past year or so, which was basically, she's out today. So I went back into the building's hallway where I had previously erected a large 3-man tent, and I picked up the tent and I walked it into the Gear offices right past the receptionist, who was yelling and screaming, and you can't come in here. And I popped it down right in front of the door to Bob Guccione Jr.'s office. And he was sitting behind his desk smoking and talking on the phone or something. And there was a big ruckus and commotion and people running over saying, who are you? You can't be here. Imagine doing that now in this climate today. Probably wouldn't happen. So I set it down, and I saw Guccione look up from his call, and he was perplexed, and he jumped up from his chair and ran over to where I was. And I had already taken off a sweater, and underneath I had a T-shirt that said, you owe me, and it had the total on it. So he wanted to know who I was, and he said he got very upset And he said he was going to call the cops. And I said, go ahead and call him, man. I already called the New York Observer. At that, he shut up and he went back into his office, and I just slipped inside the tent and zippered it shut and picked up my book that I'd brought and started reading. And I could see through the flywall of the tent there that the women in the photography department were sort of chuckling to themselves and pointing at me and everything. And so I was there basically a couple hours. And the finance director, this guy came over and sort of came over and meekly knocked on the tent. And I said, okay, I unzipped and let him in. And he came, sat down Indian style next to me. And he said, boy, we really wish you hadn't done it this way. And I said, well, I've been waiting a year for this check. So anyway, they ultimately paid me. And that was the last contact I had with gear.
Oh, that's hard to believe you wouldn't have further contact, but a ballsy move. But you know what? I having been a journalist in a previous life myself, and sort of the vicissitudes, especially now in the world of journalism, I think it's far worse and more uncertain than ever before, given all kinds of different reasons. Right? I think that, but ironically, though, I think it sets a tone, I think, maybe for sort of the craziness of this league that you ultimately would wind up covering in book form. So did this happen before, during, or after the publishing contract for the book on this?
Oh, well, it may actually, the answer to that may inform my motivation for pulling that stunt in the first place, because I was already deep in the midst of writing the darn thing. So, writing a book would make anybody crazy. It certainly did make me crazy. So, but I think what you're really asking about is how this thing became a book. And, I go back to that plane ride from Vegas to New York. I hadn't even begun to write the magazine article, but I started thinking that this thing could be a book. So it was right around the time that I filed the magazine article that I contacted a few agents, literary agents, and I found one who really liked the idea, and he helped me find a publisher and an editor at that publishing house who also really liked the idea. So I didn't think it was going to go anywhere, and miraculously it did. And so I found a really good editor at Crown, and we started conceiving it. And that's when I decided that the way I wanted to cover this league, because the first game had just kicked off, was to follow around one team, not to tell like a season in a team's life, but just to focus the larger narrative on something specific. So I couldn't think of a better city than Vegas, and just thought it would be a fun opportunity to locate myself there. So I got on a plane, flew back to Vegas, and lived there for about 6 months, and shadowed that team around.
All right, time for me to catch my breath, get a cool, tasty beverage, and remind you, while we do so, that our friends at Audible are here to remind you that you can get a free audiobook download of your choice from over 180,000 titles. If you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats and use that link, of course, to try for yourself a free audiobook on us, gratis, if you will. And you will love the idea of audiobooks. It's an awesome way to kill time and occupy and stimulate your mind, perhaps when your eyes are busy doing something else. And of course, there are plenty of interesting books to be found, especially in the world of sports and sports history. And I think our audience might enjoy a few of these, of course, including the seminal work by baseball legend Jim Bouton. It's called Ball 4. It is not only written, but it's also narrated by him. You could use your free credit for that book. And of course, as you know, Ball 4 centers around the 1969 one-year wonder that is the Seattle Pilots of Major League Baseball, but obviously the background for a whole lot of other observations about the sport of baseball. And it remains to this day perhaps one of the most celebrated writings about the sport of baseball in this country. Of course, you can also, if you're not a big baseball fan, you can go into the world of soccer with the autobiography called My Turn by Johan Cruyff, the late Johan Cruyff, perhaps one of the world's best ever soccer players. He of Dutch heritage, of course. Plenty of great legendary years at club play as well as national team play for the Dutch team, as well as, for our audience, maybe a little bit of interest, his journeys in the North American Soccer League in the late 70s and early 80s with the Washington Diplomats and the Los Angeles Aztecs. And of course, if you're into football, there's probably no better book, especially if you find yourself really interested in the sort of deep and rich history of the NFL, with the book called NFL Football, A History of America's New National Pastime. It is written by Richard Crepeau and narrated by Marlon May. That, too, is an audiobook that you could choose from over, like I said, 180,000 titles. There's got to be something in there that's going to be of interest to you. And by all means, give it a try. And we appreciate your doing so at audibletrial.com/goodseats. And again, you're going to get your free audiobook download. You can cancel at any time. And again, even if you cancel it, you can keep that book as long as your device exists. So again, we appreciate it. Give it a try. audibletrial.com/goodseats. And now, back to our conversation. Well, so walk us through some of the major vignettes or points that you frame the narrative around. You said that. So, were you there for the first game then, or this was after the first game?
No, no. This, the process of pitching and selling the book proposal and getting the book contract together, it kind of mirrored the slapdash and nature of the preparation for the league itself. I mean, they only had 1 year to put this thing together. I mean, this was their own timeline that they enforced on themselves foolishly, and I think it really showed in the final product. And so there wasn't much time. There wasn't much preparation. I didn't have a lot of time either. So I believe if I remember correctly, I showed up in Vegas in week 2 of the season. So I missed the first game, which, as you remember, the first televised game was actually from Vegas against I think it was the New York, New Jersey team. So I showed up in the second game and just started going to practices there and started trying to meet the guys and the coaches and also I was fielding letters from Vince McMahon's office threatening that they're going to shut down my book and all this stuff. So it was just, I jumped out the plane and the parachute came out and I just landed wherever I could.
All right. So what were you thinking as you were on the plane going there, right? Because you had seen, like the rest of the nation, the first game on NBC and a few of the other ones on the other networks. What was your sort of predisposed impression about what you were going to see or encounter once you sort of hit the ground in Las Vegas in the midst of week 2?
Yeah, well, kind of like you're going on a date, and on the way there you kind of feel like you don't really want to go, but you've already committed, and you have manners, and you don't want to be impolite to her, because I saw what everybody else saw. Well, I don't know what everybody else saw. Let me put it that way. What I saw was minor league football, and that's okay. Nothing wrong with a minor league sport, but the problem was that Ebersol and Vince McMahon put the darn thing on primetime network TV. And I just felt like, something's going to go wrong here.
That was your thinking when you were sitting there watching that game on television. Because you had McMahon there, sort of kind of bombastically, and you had it almost became. It was interesting because there was clearly some moments of like pomp and pageantry and interest, right? But there were also some, I don't know, I'll put words in your mouth, embarrassment chills, I guess, for some of the little antics that were going on the set.
Yeah. Like I said earlier, I'm not a pro wrestling fanatic. So those things didn't really interest me, and I found them to be sort of awkward and poorly done. But that wasn't really what I saw as the biggest problem. And I mean, look, just as a further background, so I grew up in a sports household. My father was a sportscaster, and he had worked for local stations in various cities in the U.S., and then he ultimately worked for ESPN, and he was a reporter, like a field reporter out in the field for SportsCenter for a number of years. And growing up, I carried gear on his crews. So, I was in this whole sports TV thing from the time I was a kid. And I was a big sports fan. I grew up playing sports. And I felt like I wasn't just a regular old fan, even though I was that also. I felt like maybe I had, I don't know, I don't want to boast here, but I felt like maybe I had just a touch more acumen when it came to this issue than others may have. And what I saw there was, oh boy, because you can lather it up with all kinds of pro wrestling style vignettes and made for TV moments. If those go terribly wrong and if they're very awkward, if you have a good fundamental product, it doesn't matter. And what I saw was that the product they were selling, which was not the vignettes, the product was the football. That the product they were selling just wasn't. It didn't match the level of a primetime telecast. That's what I saw in that first game. And when I was on that plane going to Vegas, I said, oh boy, okay, so I just signed this book contract. It's my first ever book contract. And man, did I make a terrible mistake there.
Well, but that said, was there at what point, either on that plane ride or during the, I don't know, the ongoing story that unfolded in front of you, to just say, wait a minute, this could be a potential disaster, and I might have a front row seat in this and actually be more interesting as a book?
Yeah, I mean, I guess somewhere toward the end, but it's hard to have that perspective because I think in this instance, primarily because there was this wide, soft underbelly of the league's experience where it was just sort of pathetic. It was like the whole middle of the season felt like to me that it wasn't a big train wreck. It was just kind of boring, and that's the worst. So it was hard for me as someone who was just kind of like starting out and trying to figure out how to tell longer stories. It was hard for me to see how I could recover this thing.
All right. Well, so you get there. You have the intestinal fortitude to show up, and so what in your mind was sort of your path for the narrative and the story, or did you kind of want to let sort of things settle? What was sort of your, I guess at the time, sort of your blueprint or your starting point to kind of gather enough of what was going on with this team and the league to kind of get into a narrative? Or was it largely an exercise in, this is more of a process question, was it more largely an exercise of just getting to as many people and events surrounding it at the time, and then sort of let the story kind of maybe present itself to you?
Well, the story was ongoing, and no one knew what it ultimately was going to be. Certainly I didn't know. So it was just a matter, like you said, of trying to talk to as many people as you could. And I felt like what I was trying to do initially was to tell the larger story of the league. That was the A story. And the B story was to find a guy or two on the Las Vegas team who could be emblematic in some way, or just who had a cool story and an interesting yarn. Because there were a lot of interesting guys in that league. These were the hodgepodge of guys who had a cup of coffee in the NFL and were trying to get back, or maybe they were a bit older, maybe they'd been injured, and then there were young guys who had come out of Division 2 or 3 football, for example, and had gotten passed over and saw this as their way, their audition tape for the NFL. So there were a lot of interesting people in that league. So for me, just looking at it as a canvas, it was like trying to find that story or those personal stories on the Vegas team by getting to know some of these guys, but also just keeping a watchful eye on all events XFL more broadly, because like I say, when you're in the middle of something like that, you don't know what the story is, because it hasn't told itself yet. It hasn't happened yet. It is in the midst of happening. So you just got to keep your antenna up and follow your instinct. That if you feel like you see something developing that could be interesting, you hop on a plane and you go try to talk to that person.
Well, okay, so let's talk about one of the signature ones, right? In many respects, you kind of stumbled into one of those players, perhaps the most, I guess, even still to this day, most memorable names and players and stories in the form of Rod Smart. They're playing for the Outlaws. How did that part of the conversation and that part of the narrative come into your purview, and how did you kind of know to center on him a bit? Maybe that first game had something to do with it. Yeah.
No, it wasn't even up to me. It was just so obvious that this guy was the guy. Like you said, I completely got lucky that he happened to be playing for Vegas, and that was the city I chose. So just for people who don't remember, Rod Smart was a running back for the Vegas Outlaws. And one of the interesting things, which the league, it was one of their so-called innovations. One of the things that they allowed players to do was, instead of putting their last name on the back of the jersey, they could put basically anything they wanted, as long as it was approved by the league. The league didn't want anything, any obscenities or anything like that on the back of the jersey. So anyway, Rod was the guy who came out in the first game in the back of his jersey and said, "He hate me," and that fascinated everybody, because they wanted to know what the heck did that mean, and who is this guy? And like you said, I got lucky, and he was just the guy, the running back on the Vegas Outlaws. And so I knew I got to focus on this guy. I got to get to know this guy. And I did get to know him, and he was a very interesting, friendly guy. I spent a lot of time in Rod's apartment in Vegas, and it was hard to find time with him, because he was, let me just say, the ladies in Vegas found him very attractive, and he had this little bit of fame, which was very cool to see him enjoying it. He was generally in good spirits all the time, and I just wanted to spend as much time with him as I could. So I would try and make plans with him by phone. He was very elusive. I don't think in a bad way. I just think he was busy with football, and he was a young guy and he had friends in town and was enjoying himself when he was going out to the nightclubs in Vegas. I mean, this is Las Vegas after all. And here he was in the national spotlight to some degree. So when I did find time with him, I found him to be very open and, like I said, very friendly. And he told me an interesting story about how he came up with this nickname, which he subsequently altered when he told almost everybody else. So I felt like the true story of it never really got out. I did include it in the book, but it really was. It came down to tryouts for the team, and he was on the bubble. He'd gone to Western Kentucky, which, if you remember, that's where Jim Harbaugh's dad coached for many years, Jack Harbaugh. In fact, Jim Harbaugh's first job was as a recruiting hand at Western Kentucky. So it was known as a good program, but anyway, Rod was not a highly sought-after guy. That's why he ended up in the XFL in the first place. And on one of the final days of training camp, he was on the bubble, and he heard word that the coaches were going to cut him for the Outlaws. And it just came into his mind, this phrase, like, "He hated me." He meaning the coach. And it took a play in the last scrimmage to keep him on the team. He returned a punt or had a long run, like 80, 90 yards for a touchdown. The coaches decided, we got to keep this guy. But it was great hanging out with Rod, getting to know him. I also he's from Lakeland, Florida, and when the Outlaws played down in Florida, I went to his hometown and I met with his mother. I spent an afternoon with her, and boy, was that an interesting story. She had an anklet, like a bracelet from the local authorities. She was on some sort of probation. There was some convictions for drug trafficking in her past, and but she was very, very proud of Rod. And anyway, I spent a nice afternoon with her. She was very, very welcoming and a nice lady. And it was great to see Rod go on. Rod went on and played in the Super Bowl for the Carolina Panthers. He had a 3, 4, 5 year career in the NFL. So, the XFL did very well by him.
Yeah, I
did
think
very well by the XFL, rather.
Yeah, no, I think actually some of the NFL folks would even admit that his popularity, or at least the naming, sort of got their attention, at least to quote unquote give him a look, right? And so almost again the triumph, I guess, of promotion over maybe necessarily the quality, or maybe at the very least it's a it's a tiebreaker when there's a lot of mediocrity and something becomes memorable and it gives him a shot, and he certainly made that happen for him. But so what about the rest of the team then? And putting Smart sort of in the middle, I guess, of that story. I mean, through the eyes of the Las Vegas Outlaws, I mean, were they a typical team in this crazy 8-team circuit? Were they an outlier? What were you seeing in the league through their eyes and the way that they played and or went through the franchise? Because they were probably about average, I guess, in terms of attendance, although, I would argue Las Vegas, not really sort of the preeminent professional sports town. So there's probably an element of curiosity and or whatever from that. But what were you seeing sort of through the eyes of the Vegas franchise, either uniquely or endemically relative to the rest of the league?
Yeah, boy, again, for me, the story with the Vegas Outlaws really came down to the personal stories. I didn't see these guys as being touched in any way by these larger issues that we've talked about the network's economic pressures. None of that, and that's not surprising. They weren't touched by any of Vince McMahon's bluster or the fact that they wanted to do these crazy vignettes all the time on the sidelines. None of that stuff mattered to these guys, and none of it affected them. These were guys who'd been playing football all their lives, and their dream was to be in the NFL. And some of them had been there and were trying to get back. Some of them had been overlooked and were trying to get there for the first time. And that's all it was. They saw the XFL as an opportunity to get paid to play football and continue their careers. And every one of these guys had an interesting story. If you're a sports person, if you're a football person. I remember this guy who was a defensive lineman, Kelvin Kinney, one of these just enormous people, great athletes. Kelvin had played in the NFL for a few years, and he was an edge rusher, a sacker, and had sacked a couple big NFL quarterbacks, but he had all these injuries, and he was a bit of a hard luck story. Another guy, Ryan Clement, who was the starting quarterback, he had been the starting quarterback of Miami. And remember that amazing string of quarterbacks the Hurricanes produced. Well, Ryan came right at the wrong time when the program was going downhill. He was supposed to be the next big thing, and it didn't work out for him in Miami. So not long after he left Miami, he found himself bouncing at a bar, and he was drinking all the time, and he had to get himself back together to even get to the Outlaws. So these stories were sort of sad in a way, but seeing the fact that the XFL existed allowed these guys to put things together for one more shot. So, again, we can talk all we want about Vince McMahon and business and broadcasting and all that, but the people who are actually in this league are just regular folks trying to achieve something personally. So definitely there were some interesting guys in that team.
Well, and a bunch, that team, but I suspect broadly the XFL generally, whereas they found, some more attention and some future gigs out of this, despite the demise of the league. I mean, you mentioned a couple of, you mentioned the Super Bowl. I mean, there was, I guess, Kelly Herndon, the cornerback, was with the Seahawks in Super Bowl 40. You had, is it Mark Grebe or Grebe? He was the quarterback who actually took over for Ryan Clement when he was injured. And then he wound up going to the Arena Football League, which is also a really rich tableau of players looking for a continuation of their careers and or another shot. And he wound up
there were a couple wide receivers on that team, too. There were a couple wide receivers on that team. Sorry to interrupt you, but there was a guy, Mike Furry, who I think had played in Division 2, 3. He had gone to Ohio State, but really didn't see the field transfer. He was a smaller wide receiver guy, and he was young. He was just out of college and played for the Outlaws. And he went on to have quite a good NFL career. I think one year he had almost 100 receptions. He played for the Rams. He played for the Lions. And he had quite a distinction, but he played both sides of the ball in the NFL. He played wide receiver and defensive back and starting at both positions. So very impressive. There was also another wide receiver, if I'm not mistaken, a guy named Yo Murphy, who I think also played the Super Bowl. That's just off one team. And so these were all guys on the bubble. And like you said, pertaining to Rod Smart, sometimes if you're a bubble guy, you got to get noticed somehow. You just need that one shot and that one chance, and the XFL gave that to some of these guys.
Well, so most of the nation saw, either in the not so gracious headlines and the weekly sort of decline, I guess, of the product on television and all the various shenanigans that came with it. What were you seeing on the ground with these players and sort of the week by week kind of, getting through the week and practice and the games and stuff? Did you notice any besides sort of that zeal to play? Did you get any sort of broader sense of either excitement, encouragement? Were they pushing those distractions of the circus tent component of all this league away and just trying to focus on the game? Or, did you notice any sort of change perhaps in all of the team, the players, the coaches, the ownership, or the stadium personnel, whomever, about sort of maybe this, I guess, it seemed to be, from an outsider's perspective, a slide, I guess, into just abject craziness by the end of all of it.
Right. Yeah, I think anybody who's played on a team and has taken it seriously would understand that the path of the players on this team is really no different from what we may have experienced, even like say on a youth level. It's just some pressure and a little bit more desperation, given the fact that these guys are trying to make a living at this thing. I think that when I said earlier that this high level these larger issues didn't really affect these guys, the one thing that did affect them as the season wore on, and they, like everybody else, were reading about the ratings going down. The one thing that did affect them was the prospect of a second season. Is this thing going to last? Because NBC had signed on for, I believe, 3 years of this thing. And there were whispers, like, this thing is performing so poorly in the ratings that NBC might just opt out. And for these guys, that meant a lot. Like, are we going to have a job next year? I think most of the guys enjoyed it. They enjoyed playing in the XFL. It was, what's the alternative? It's not like there's a minor league. It's not like there's a AAA, AA ball like in baseball. There's the NFL. Yes, there's the CFL, but in the United States at least, you had the Arena League. In terms of how the players are treated, how they're paid, just the level of everything was pretty high. And I think these guys enjoyed it. By and large, they enjoyed playing there, and they were eager for a second season. So when it began to seem like it was possible that there wouldn't be a second season, and I think there was, general, I don't want to say despair, but guys weren't happy about that prospect.
What did you maybe just a quick sort of catalog of some of the more eye-opening things, either happy and amazing or just downright depressing and or sordid that you saw in your travels? I suspect that you were in the stadium for a couple of games, that you were on the road occasionally with the team. You were kind of saw some of the players and the coaches and the organization kind of sort of in their downtime. Any things that kind of stand out in that day to day that maybe reminded you that perhaps this is going to wind up being a pretty darn good story in the book form?
Well, look, you got to remember this is quite a number of years ago now, so it's hard to remember all of those poignant details. And I think whatever there may have been, it's probably in the book there. But not to discount your question. I think there's some things that come to mind. For example, Ryan Clements, the quarterback. I really liked Ryan. I thought he was a good guy trying to achieve his dream, and it just seemed to be slipping away from him again. And that was painful to watch. And he also had a girlfriend or fiance who was very invested in his future and his success. And I saw some friction there, and it was a little hard. It was a little hard to watch that because you're a journalist, of course. You're a reporter. You're not supposed to be part of the story, of course, but you're still a human being. And these people are nice enough and kind enough to share their time and their stories with you. And the part of you wants to see them do well. Even if you can separate that part from the journalist who has to ultimately write about the thing in a candid way. So it was hard sometimes to see some of these guys go through that. That's you'd probably find similar stories in the NFL. Guys who get injured, guys who get cut. But at least they've already achieved a dream of some sort just by being there. And the XFL was, one step removed from even that. So it made some of the tougher stories a little bit harder to take.
All right. So by the time the $1 million game comes around, and the Outlaws didn't even make the playoffs in an 8-team league, which obviously tells you quite a bit.
Right.
Right. What was your and your editors' thinking about what this story was about, and or what you how this book sort of was kind of look? Because I think to just about every outsider, right, that $1 million game was kind of like almost like a relief to kind of get it out of the system. Got to follow through with it. Yep. And I don't think anybody really legitimately thought that there was going to be much more of this after that game. Where were you in the process of the writing the book and or the narrative and the story, and where were you thinking that and how do you think this book was going to come out, and what kind of story you were going to kind of reveal? Yeah,
well, there were a couple of things that happened right toward the end of the season that maybe guided me towards some conclusion. One of them was the fact that Rod Smart, he hate me. The Outlaws lost their last handful of games. They were still in contention, and they just went on a bit of a losing streak to close out the season. And I believe, if my memory serves, the last game, they were in it towards the end of the game, and Rod Smart was carrying the ball. This was in Vegas at Sam Boyd Stadium, and he was going in for a touchdown, and he fumbled it through the end zone for a touchback, effectively losing the game for the team. And I think that was his last carry in the XFL. And that was fitting in some way. I don't know what it fit, but it was interesting that here's Rob, the sort of face of the league and the Vegas franchise, ending the season more or less for the guy. And the other thing was at the LA Coliseum, which was where the $1 million game. It's so funny. What a silly name for a championship game. That's where it was played. And so I had a press pass, and I was down on the field roaming around when I saw, oh my goodness, there's Dick Ebersol, and there's Vince McMahon, and they were standing next to one another on the sidelines, observing their creation. And I'd never met either of them. They didn't know what I looked like, and so it was easy for me to just sort of sidle up and eavesdrop a little bit. And yeah, they weren't saying much. They were just sort of, it was just a like a tableau, like an image, you know. And so I got on the plane, I tacked up in Vegas, went back to New York where I was living, and sat down and took out my notes and everything. And I said, oh my goodness, what the heck am I going to think of this? And I was pretty discouraged because, as I said, most of the games and most of the season I thought were just kind of boring, and it was minor league football. And look, I'm a huge college football fan, and hey, that's minor league football, right? I mean, it is the highest level for that age group, but it's the level below the NFL. So there's something different, I guess, about college football, the history and the pageantry and all that, the coaching, the stadium. You know, it's a different package than the XFL, of course, in so many ways. So I sat down and I said, what am I going to do? So I met up with my editor, Pete Fornatell at Crown, and Pete really believed in this from the beginning. Pete he was a bit of a pro wrestling guy too, so he really brought a lot to the project in that sense, a lot of knowledge and understanding, and he really wanted this thing to work. Now he told me later that toward the end of the season or right after the season, that his boss came to him and said, I think we got to kill this book. Because they didn't think they could sell it. And because they saw what was going on. They saw that there were no ratings for this thing, that people just weren't interested anymore. And Pete said that he pushed back, and they talked about it for a while. They said, like, look, we'll kill this book and we'll find another book for him to write. And Pete basically said, look, he'd be really upset. He'd be devastated. He put all this work in. He moved out to Vegas. You know. So that pushback saved the book, but now I had to write it. And so we had many discussions about how this thing was going to go, and then I just had to begin.
And the timing of it, though, came out in what, 2003, right? A year and a half after the league? Is that right?
No, it came out the next year. The
next year, 2002. Okay.
Yep.
And it still sits. I should have seen that's right on the page 3 here as I open it up. So the aftermath, though. So this is interestingly, this is still really the only major treatise, I guess, on this league. And now I wonder, given that being some sort of the seminal sort of writing about this league. Given that the league is coming back, and albeit in a different form next year, you wonder why or when perhaps it might be appropriate to reissue and potentially put some new framing around some of your original writing, perhaps through the lens of the last almost 20 years, and almost as a table set for what the new version of this XFL will wind up becoming. Any interest in that, or is that sort of way in the past in your rear view mirror, or because I suspect that there's going to be some general interest and recollection and perhaps some, shall we say, revisionist history as the new one gets going?
Mm-hmm. Well, listen, I think some of the words you're using are a bit lofty for this silly little book I wrote many years ago. Treatise? I mean, listen, you're being very respectful, and I appreciate that, and thank you. this is a book that I wrote when I was younger and more or less just starting out. And I didn't know how to write a book. I mean, who does before you actually do it? Nobody does. And I, just learned along the way. And I'm proud that it came out and that my editor and I worked it up to the point where we could publish it. And I'm happy for the experience. But I'll tell you what, I'd rather buy up all of the copies and put them in the basement and go sell XFL T-shirts on the corner to make money instead.
Spoken like a true writer who's always, doubting the quality and their approach and all that. Look, I think, and obviously I'm a huge, dare I say, a geek for teams and leagues no longer with us, right? It's the whole reason I'm doing this equally, if not more, silly little endeavor podcast, right? But it's I'm just thinking about it from a marketing perspective. I think about it from all the hype that's to come, the desire probably to sort of distance or at least reframe what this new league is going to be about. And look, we've all moved on, right? And perhaps in your career, and you're actually doing much more, shall we say, serious work with your efforts with the Wall Street Journal and covering the defense and security spaces and other things. The story of the XFL is going to come back, right? We had a very interesting conversation a couple of months ago with, as you probably know, Jeff Pearlman, who was a childhood fanatic of the old USFL, and the irony of our current president and his role in that league, almost as a microcosm in his perspective of how he sort of approaches management generally and his approach to running the country. It just shows that these stories and the effect that they've had on in this case professional football going forward. You mentioned it earlier in the conversation. I don't know. Hey, I'm not telling you what to do, but it just seems to me that somebody, and guess who's got some authority in having done so even in his earliest of professional years. If anybody's got
you make a lot of sense. Tim, you make a lot of sense, and I certainly don't mean to belittle the thought at all. Look, writing a book is a life experience. It takes a long time. There are many moments when you're at the end of your rope and you're just despairing and you're thinking, why the heck did I choose to do this? So any book, no matter how good it is, for the person who wrote it, it has some meaning, and there are a lot of memories wrapped up in it, and it's part of your life. But I just, when I look at that book, I just think that book is I call it an apprentice work. It was something that taught me a lot just in the doing of it. And I wouldn't necessarily say it's reflective of work that I subsequently did, where I felt like I was more in control and knew a little bit more about the process. It's still very difficult to write for me all the time, and I dread it all the time. But I'm drawn to it, and it's part of me. But look, we haven't really even talked about the fact that Vince McMahon is going to reboot the XFL. I guess next year. So I think definitely there's going to be a lot of media attention on that event, and there's going to be a lot of interest in digging back into history and saying, okay, well, how's this going to be different from the last one? So what was the last one? What really went on? So nobody else wrote a book about this, and so I guess you definitely have a point.
Well, look, and I'm hardly on a crusade here, but I'll stop just short of it. Okay, the book has been out of print for some time. Obviously, we'll have a link to it and used copies in other places. It has a high value for those used copies. It's in the hundreds of dollars, believe it or not.
Oh wow!
My thought is that economically, at least in the economics of the internet, it seems like there's a market here. It's the only reason.
Who knew? I mean, I have a bunch in a box in the closet here. Maybe I can, make a little money.
Well, again, you've got. I see. I'm looking at Amazon, our partner here for selling books. I see new versions going for $532.26.
No.
And
no.
Used
That's
copies,
impossible.
No, I'm telling you. And the used copy is $121. So there's something
Who is
to it.
buying these things for that much money?
Well, maybe
Who
after
could this possibly be?
Maybe after listening to this episode, you're going to get a few more inquiries. So all I'm getting at is that so if you call yourself a fan of pro football and you remember the XFL and that the train wreck of a league it wound up becoming on national television, and you have not read Brett's book, you got to find your way to a copy. I'm not giving away mine. Maybe I'll mail mine to Brett and he can sign it for me. That's about it. But
I'd be happy to do it.
It is a fun journey. I think to your point earlier, it's not exhaustive. It's not sort of a blow by blow sort of a statistical history. This is a narrative of a story of a league in all its craziness. And I would argue there's plenty more to sort of come out of this. And I think a newer spotlight's going to be on some of the original version of that as this new XFL, despite its desire to be distant from the original version. And Brett, look, this has been a treat for me because this is a league that I know our audience has been wanting to get more detailed and understood, some understanding about. I suspect there's a lot more stories out there, and for better or for worse, yours is the go-to writing about this league, and I suspect it won't be the end of the investigation of what came before the new version coming out next year. So I appreciate your time and thank you for being part of it. Well,
Tim, thank you very much for having me on it. I think what you're doing is really interesting, and I was glad to get an invitation from you. And I found your thoughts and questions very well informed. And wish you luck going forward with everything. I will say that I think the best thing about that book is that it's short.
I think you're being too hard on yourself. I loved it. It's the reason why I've kept it for almost 20 years. All right, before we run, give our audience a sense of what are you up to now? What kind of projects are you working on?
Yeah.
Do you ever fancy yourself going back in the world of sports, or are you long gone from that into your current work?
Oh, I'm not. I hope I'm not long gone from anything. I like to keep an open mind, and I'm always looking for a good yarn and good story wherever it may be. So after that book, just real quickly here. So I lived abroad for about a decade. I lived in Russia and Ukraine and Brazil, and I became more of like an international correspondent, if you will. And still writing for magazines. And then I came back to the U.S. and I hooked on with ESPN, and I started writing for their magazine. I worked there for a number of years, and another book came out of that experience as well. That was a book about match fixing in global soccer. It's really a crime story focusing on Chinese triads and Singaporean match fixers and how they upended the game throughout the entire world, and about an Australian guy who was the head of security at FIFA at the time, who was a longtime cop who had also been a director at Interpol, who was chasing these guys down. So that was a really interesting story. And a couple of years ago, I left ESPN to take a job at the Wall Street Journal, where I write about national security. It sounds very serious and important. Again, I'm just looking for good stories and good yarns and things that have real importance and meaning. All right. Well, we're going to leave you in this conversation, and again, thank you for it, with the notion of the continuing yarn of the XFL. And I don't know, sleep on it, Brett. I think there's still something there. I will. Well, there you have it. That's an interesting conversation, don't you think? The XFL is something that continues to intrigue me, and I think is only going to get more interesting in the months in the lead up to the relaunch of the XFL this time next year. And look, what's coming up next week is even yet another challenger league, the Alliance of American Football, founded by the son
of the one of the co-founders of the original XFL, Charlie Ebersol. He the son of Dick Ebersol, the one of the main characters in this original XFL story. So some interesting circularness in all of that story. But you will find a link to this book on our website, of course, at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up episode 98. You will see a link to Amazon. And again, I will tell you that because this book is out of print, you will find this book not to be inexpensive. It is rather pricey. Some of the used versions are probably approaching $100 and so bucks. And there are even some new versions out there, or new copies, brand new copies that is not used, that are circulating out there, or not, available for $400 or $500. But it's I hate to say it's a collector's item, but it's a great book. I have a copy of it. I've kept it for all these years on my bookshelf. It is, frankly, the only book devoted to the XFL. Some great stories in there. As you heard me bring up to Brett's attention, not only the costs of the books on the black market, shall we say, but it feels to me, and as a nominal sort of marketing and media guy, it feels to me that the timing may just be right to not only reissue, but perhaps even reframe the original story of the XFL as the new one gets ready to rumble, so to speak. Perhaps a wish, and maybe unrequited at that, but it's well worth seeking out. It's a great book, and it's a fascinating topic, one that I know, and I'm certain that we will go deeper into, especially as the new league sort of gets up and running. We will want to delve into what used to be the previous version of the XFL, for all its faults. Some fun and wacky stories, and some amazing good things to come out of that league. Yet to discover. And we look forward to digging in and finding some of those folks and people and stories to share with you about the XFL and a whole bunch of other stuff, for God's sakes. Not just that, but all the things and teams and leagues that we focus here on this little show each and every week. All right. Before we run, I want to say thank you, of course, to our friends at Podfly Productions. Jerry Payne, the good doctor, always doing his job. Podfly.net. That's the place to go to find out more about them and all their podcasting opportunities that they can help you with. That's podfly.net. Podfly Productions, the name of the company. And let's see, what else? Please, if there's anything you could do to help our show, we would love you not only to partake of our wares from our sponsors, of course, but also rate and review, will you, the show? Wherever you can. That's iTunes or Apple Podcasts, or the myriad of places now that we're publishing and you can find this show. Wherever you can rate and review, especially if it's a good review, thumbs up, 5 stars, whatever, a couple of words of goodness there, we'd appreciate it tremendously. It's the least you can do, literally. It's the least expensive thing that is no cost to you. Except perhaps for the bandwidth that required to enter a couple of keystrokes. Would you please just review the show and let your friends out there know that you like it, and hopefully that'll find through algorithmic means some other friends that might enjoy the show to download and subscribe, and we appreciate that. We also appreciate you following us on social media. You'll find us at Good Seats Still on Twitter. You'll find us on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available. You'll find a little webpage devoted to us on Facebook. You can send us email either through our link on goodseatsstillavailable.com. Of course, you can go there for all kinds of other stuff too, all of our back episodes. But you want to send us an email directly, we'll go right ahead. It's hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. All right, so I think that's all the ways you can connect with us and support us and all that kind of stuff. We thank you for listening. Enjoy the new spring football coming your way from the AAF, and we'll look forward to some more cool stuff coming up. Not only football, but tons of other great stuff in the hopper. Lots of sports, lots of stuff coming your way. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next week. Until then, best wishes.